So let's talk about cognitive biases. I've mentioned obstacles to critical thinking. That's how I started this conversation with informal fallacies and the discussions before that about obstacles like your feelings and emotions, the prejudices that you grew up with, the faulty authorities that you may depend on for your information, or groupthink and popularity, just believing what other people believe. So there's quite a few obstacles to good thinking. Why do we need critical thinking? One major reason is so that we can overcome the obstacles toward good thinking, like feelings, prejudices, authorities, and informal fallacies, which are our logical errors in thinking. Well, another major obstacle to our thinking or good thinking is cognitive biases. Cognitive biases. Now, you may have heard of the word cognitive before. In Texas, there are classes called cognitive intervention, where they teach you something about, making decisions that will meet your needs over time and following along with this Franklin reality model. Some of you may have been in cognitive behavioral therapy classes, anger management classes. There's just a lot of different therapeutic programs in the prison system that are based on a cognitive behavioral therapy model. Cognitive just means thinking. Cognition, cognitive, they are making reference to our thinking processes, our thinking abilities, and thinking in general. So a cognitive bias is a kind of unconscious, mostly unconscious bias in the way that we think. Now, a cognitive ability is sometimes it's referred to as an intellectual ability. Sometimes it's referred to as cognitive function. So I think I've mentioned this before, but when you're really trying to study and learn, you're going to hear people use different words, but they mean the same thing. So whether it's called cognitive ability or intellectual ability or cognitive function, it's really getting at the same thing. And cognitive ability is the mental power or the mental capacity that you have to perform various tasks that involve acquiring information, processing information, storing information, and using that information. So of the many things that you do as you think, they at least involve acquiring, processing, storing, and making use of information that you gather from the world. So just from those few things that I just mentioned, you can tell that our memory is a cognitive ability. You may have heard of short-term and long-term memory. So remembering a person's name after you meet them might be a short-term memory issue, or remembering how to do addition and subtraction might be a long-term memory issue. A short-term memory issue might also be when you're trying to do a complicated math problem and you have to hold all these other numbers or formulations in mind at the same time. This is often why math is so difficult, because many of us are limited in our short-term memory processes. So our cognitive ability refers to all these different things. It can include our perception, literally the way that we see things with our eyes, what we pay attention to, or our hearing even. My daughter is hearing impaired, and so the way that she understands many things in the world is different from the way that people who have normal hearing understand them. So cognitive abilities can do with memory. They can have to do with our language, our sight, our hearing, all these things, right? Some of these abilities, like our memory, as you may have gathered, they affect our mathematical ability. So the degree to which we can do mathematical calculations is often dependent on our memory. Our verbal ability, the way that we make use of words. I don't personally think that I'm very high in my verbal ability. I don't have as wide a vocabulary as many people that I aspire to be, and I don't make use of a wide variety of terms. Those are cognitive abilities. Now, all of these abilities, when they work together to understand the world, to understand information, we can call that a cognitive system. So you have cognitive abilities, so memory, or perception, whether it's through hearing or seeing, decision-making, problem-solving, these things. When these are all interconnected in different ways, we can call those cognitive systems or cognitive structures. And at present, there are two major systems that are important to understand in the discussion of critical thinking. These are usually called just System 1 and System 2. Sometimes you might hear them called type 1 and type 2. So there are several different names, but it's usually always broken down into two different categories, whether it's system 1 and type 1 or system 2 and type 2. These are two different cognitive systems. These are two different systems you're making use of as you go about learning information and perceiving the world. When I do a more advanced and complex version of this critical thinking course, maybe next year in 2024, I'm actually going to break this down into three systems. System 2 actually has two divisions. At least this is the way that current cognitive psychology tends to break things down. You have system 1 and system 2, and within system 2, you have two pieces. One is the algorithmic mind, and one is the rational mind. But for now, we're just going to talk about system 1 and system 2. So system 1 thinking is the kind of thinking that is responsible for fast, quick, intuitive, automatic thoughts that you have, decisions that you have, conclusions that you have. System 1 is often driven by your emotions or gut feelings. It's often efficient in the sense that it doesn't take a lot of thought processing for you to do. It's quick, fast, and driven by your emotions. And it is the one that is prone to all of the biases and errors, right? Now, there's a lot of discussion about how system 1 and system 2 developed and what their purposes are for. But most of the time, what you will hear is that system 1, it's going to be quick, fast, automatic reactions. So like when you perceive something, you make an immediate judgment of a given situation, right? So for example, if you raise your hand in my class and I don't call on you, your immediate interpretation might be, well, he just don't like me, right? How many times have people done that over the past? How many times have you done that towards a teacher? You raise your hand, you don't get called on, or you get a bad grade and your immediate thought is, well, the teacher just don't like me. That thought was quick, fast, it was based on your feelings, and it's very prone to bias and error. Because if you had paused for reflection and thought about it for a second, thought about other possibilities, maybe the teacher didn't see you. Maybe the teacher just had to randomly choose one person out of all the people who raised their hands. Maybe the teacher is deaf in one ear and didn't hear you shout out, or maybe they're blind in one eye. I mean, there's just a bunch of different possibilities that could be true. There are other conclusions you could draw other than, oh, the teachers just don't like me. If you had paused to reflect on all of the other possibilities and then thought about the evidence you had for your conclusion, then you would be using system 2 thinking, all right? So system 1 thinking is a cognitive system that we all possess, we all go through it, and it's quick, fast, intuitive, largely based on our feelings or our gut, go with your gut kind of thing, and it's very prone to bias and error. So all of the cognitive biases, because I'm going to give examples, all of the cognitive biases that I'm going to talk about, they're all stemming from system 1 thinking. And system 1 thinking is the system that we have to learn how to regulate through good critical thinking. We have to learn how to train system 1 to make better, more accurate, quick, fast judgments. And we can do that, but it takes a lot of learning and practice and habit. So system 2 is slower, it's more analytical, it's more deliberate, and is more dependent on logic and evidence and appropriate reasoning processes, and it requires more cognitive and mental effort. So for example, if you had drawn the conclusion, you raised your hand, the teacher didn't call on you, so your immediate thought was, well, the teacher just doesn't like me. That was a quick and fast judgment based on feelings and emotions, and it was probably wrong. It might be right, but it was probably wrong. The system 2 thinking is able to override system 1 if you give it intentional thought and practice, right? So it's based more on logic and reasoning. It's more deliberate. It's more analytical, and it can be trained in a particular way through the learning of critical thinking. So you can look up, I think you all have Khan Academy resources. You can look up something in Khan Academy about system 1 and system 2 to get more examples. In fact, looking at other resources in parallel fashion to the kind of things I'm talking about will only help you get a better understanding of what I'm trying to say. Not because I'm not saying it accurately or that they're saying it better than me, but it's always good to look at several different resources for the same idea, the same subject, because then you learn a more comprehensive, or you get a more comprehensive understanding of that thing. So go look up some other resources on System 1 and System 2 thinking, and when I do the updated version of this, the more advanced, complex version, I'll actually break it down quite a bit more and divide it into 3 sections. Now, a cognitive bias is a systematic deviation from rational thinking and judgment, and it happens because of the way our brain processes information, largely as a result of System 1 thinking. All right, it's a systematic deviation from normal rational judgment, and it happens because of the processes going on in System 1 thinking. Most of the time, System 1 thinking is bearing the weight of these biases. Now, cognitive biases are unconscious. You are not aware of the fact that you have some sort of a bias that's moving you in one direction or the other. And since it's systematic, that means every time you encounter a situation, like a teacher that doesn't acknowledge you when you raise a hand, like every time you encounter that, if your brain constantly goes to the same conclusion, well, he just don't like me, he just don't like me, then it just becomes a habit of thinking of yours to automatically assume when someone doesn't acknowledge you that they don't like you, right? This is one of the issues with a cognitive bias. It's unconscious, so you're not aware of it, and it's systematic. Every time you encounter the same situation, you draw the same conclusion. So every time someone doesn't acknowledge you, you draw the conclusion that that person doesn't like you. That would be a cognitive bias, and it's largely prone to error. So most of the time, if you draw a conclusion like that, you're wrong. And you would only know that if you slowed down, reflected on different possibilities. And when you do that, you're using System 2 thinking. Now, when I say that System 1 thinking is prone to error and bias, I am not saying that System 1 thinking is bad, useless, and that we should always override System 1 thinking with System 2 thinking or critical thinking, because System 1 thinking is useful. If you think of it in an evolutionary perspective, for example, this is an example that you'll hear in books and videos that you might watch about it. If you're living in the forest or you're living out in the wilderness somewhere and you hear some twigs snapping or branches snapping behind you, you could stick around and investigate. You could deliberate with your slow analytical thinking to try and think of all of the possibilities, all the different things that could possibly make a twig snap behind you. And if you did that, you might die, because it could have been a predator that was coming after you, that was stalking you. But if you had trained yourself that every time you heard a twig snapping, you take off running, then you're much more likely to survive. And so it is the case that System 1 thinking hasn't developed in the way it has for no reason at all. Most of the time, people will explain System 1 thinking as a result of evolution and conditioning. And so every time you encounter a similar scenario, you react in the same way, even though that reaction might be inaccurate or incorrect. So not every time a twig snaps behind you doesn't mean that there's a predator stalking you, but it's good that you react that way if you're living in the wilderness, because you're more likely to survive. Now, if you think about that example, what has happened is something in the environment happened. So a twig or a branch snapped behind you, and your brain went through a process and it came to a conclusion to run, that it's a predator. So this was potentially good. It helped you to survive. But what happened there was that it was a mental shortcut. That is what is referred to as a heuristic, Heuristic, a heuristic. It is a mental shortcut. It's a way that you process information and the world faster without a lot of thought and reflection. And the problem is that because it's a shortcut, you don't always have access to all of the information.